Okay, wonderful. Well, hi everyone. I'm Helen Young and I'm one of the directors of the board of NADP, and I'm also co-chair of the conference committee alongside Lynn Wilson, who's operations manager. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this opening session of the NADP Virtual International Conference 2021. So the theme of the conference overall is joining the dots of inclusive practice. What's the picture now? And the theme of this session today is focused on exploring the role of the disability practitioner. So I'll go on shortly to talk a bit more about how the session today will run. But in the meantime, first, I'd just like to hand over to Brian for a formal opening of the conference. And also just quickly before I do that, for those who missed the comment from me previously, if anybody does want to access captions for this session, go to the top left of your screen and you can enable them there, and they are kindly being provided by Captioned, who are supporting the conference throughout June for us, so thank you again to them. Brian, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Helen, and it's really encouraging to already see comments and welcomes on the chat. Keep doing that. And one of the things I'll be saying before I kind of start is it's really good to share practice, and actually any comments that you have, I think it's really useful to kind of share those on the chat, and I'm sure the panel will welcome that as well. So firstly, on a sunny day in Carlisle, which is where I am, I'm away at the minute, so I'm going to have to dip out very shortly after the start of this session, unfortunately, but this is the inaugural opening of the conference, and I wanted to say welcome to you all. Hope you're all safe and well. Hope you've managed to enjoy some of the sunshine after what would be classed as a month in May of mainly misery due to rain. Most of those words began with M, apart from rain, obviously. But hopefully you're able to enjoy the sunshine. In terms of the conference, we've got a fantastic lineup. I'd like to thank the NADP office and also the conference planning committee, inclusive of Helen, who's been integral in planning the conference. And we've got a really exciting prospect for you in terms of content over this week and for the next 4 or 5 weeks as well, with a whole raft of resources and videos that you can also dip in and out of at your leisure. It's also the first conference where we have actively made sure and ensured it's free as a virtual conference. We piloted a similar ethos in our conference for last year, but we wanted to make sure that was extended to this year, mainly for the fact that it's been challenging for all. And we know that financial elements and the constraints associated with busy workloads meant that actually we wanted to provide something that practitioners could engage with and could share practice with, and be in a safe environment to do so. So you are in the right place. Well, I'm hoping you're in the right place. If you've called in for this conference and you're meant to be somewhere else, stay, is all I'm going to say, because you're going to miss out if you do that. So one of the things I will mention, and I will pop it into the chat, is I have written a formal welcome, and it's available on the main web page. So follow that link. I'm not saying you have to do that now. Do that at your leisure. It is a bit long, and I apologise for that. But anyone that knows me well enough knows that I can talk for England. I have promised Helen I'll be less than 10 minutes for this, so just bear with me on this. I will go on to the session for today, and I think it's a particularly excellent start to a conference when we're thinking about the role of specialist staff in and across the sector, and I think it's inclusive of right across education, inclusive of statutory, further and higher education, and the importance of the student journey, and in particular the disabled student journey in terms of equity. And we know that the landscape in which we all work in has changed, and we know that the sector constantly changes, either on a daily basis or less. And I think in the past year, with COVID and changes in working practices for remote working, not only in terms of your everyday work, but delivering services to students, and also moving forward where there's this hybridization of using remote learning, teaching and learning, remote access, remote support, as well as the face-to-face contact, and using those in tandem, I know is a philosophy that many institutions are looking for. And I think from the vantage of the sector, and the impact on disabled students and students actually having the choice is a great position to be in. Bearing in mind that doesn't not a detriment to the challenges for the sector over the past year, but I think this is one significant positive in moving forward that I think changes the landscape for access for students. So I'm really looking forward to kind of, obviously I'm going to have to dip out, but I'm going to be wanting to watch the video and kind of catch back up on the discussion today, because I think it is hugely core and crucial to the student experience, and also the ever-changing nature of the disability practice and specialism that's related to each of those roles, and also within the institutions, organisations and organisations that you actually are working for and how they interconnect. So I'm not going to rattle on too much. One of the things I would want to say is NADP's conferences, regardless of whether they're face-to-face in person or online in this sense and virtual remote, is about sharing practice. It's about sharing what you know, sharing the challenges, thinking about the problems in your everyday work, thinking about how solutions can be developed to overcome some of those challenges, and actually looking to our colleagues across the sector, not just in the UK, but wider. And that international perspective is something that we feel is really, really important, particularly when you kind of add last year into that. What have been the developments in practice globally, internationally, across Europe? Because when I've spoken to partners in the US, as an example, and European partners recently, a lot of the challenges that we face in the UK are very similar to those with our European and global partners. And actually learning about developments in practice, developments of ways of looking at new ways of engaging with disabled students is something that I think we are excellent at doing. And it goes back to what I was saying at the very start in terms of how we adjust to a changing landscape. And I think we are at that point in time. So without rattling on too much, I'm aware of time, I would like to thank Helen, one, for leading this particular session, but also a special thank you to Brian, Dr. Chico, Pauline and Gerard as well for joining the session and being part of what I think will be an excellent discussive panel. And again, going back to the chat, using the chat to kind of feed your comments, and I'm sure the panel will be picking up on some of those comments either during the session or at a level of Q&A at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you back to Helen. Enjoy the sunshine, enjoy the conference. I hope to see you later on in the conference as well. I think I'm hosting one of the weeks. I'm really looking forward to that. Hope you can join me for that, but hope you can join all of the sessions throughout the conference. And I'm going to pass you back to Helen, who will talk to you, I think, very briefly about the balloon race.
Thanks so much, Brian. Thanks for that welcome to the conference. So yes, as I say, welcome everyone. It's great to be here today. So I thought I'd just start with a bit of general information about how the session's going to run. So we're due to finish at 2:30. The first part of the session is going to be a panel discussion, which I'll be facilitating with our wonderful panelists here, and I'll come on to introduce them in a moment. If you have any questions throughout the session or towards the end, the second part of the session is going to be opened up to attendees so that you can ask your questions to the panel. We would ask, if possible, please put your questions in the Q&A section that's in the middle of the screen at the bottom of Zoom, and that will enable us just to identify them promptly at the end. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can. Obviously, it depends how many come in and what time we've got, but we will certainly try and get to which questions we can. As I've said before, and as Brian said, do make use separately of the chat if there's any general comments. If you want to give some examples of good practice or things that you'd like to share yourselves, please do that. So yes, that's the main things. Brian mentioned the balloon race. So just to let you know, for anybody who's not seen it yet, on the homepage of the conference part of the website, the NADP website, there is opportunity to grab yourself a virtual balloon. We are having a virtual balloon race. So you can name your balloon, you can attach a message, and it will be launched next Wednesday at the conference. And those balloons will set off on a virtual 3-week week race, and the first across the line, I'm not quite sure of the details, Lynn can in the office will be able to tell us, but the first across the line wins a special prize. So it's free to enter to all conference delegates, so do bag yourself a balloon on the website. The only other thing to say, well, there's a few things, so do look as well when you're on the website at some brilliant resources, some podcasts and some videos that have been produced by a range of practitioners within the sector to accompany this week, and they're all live right now. Chico, who we'll come on to introduce in a moment, but is one of the panelists today, Writtle University, her place of work, have produced some great resources and videos there as well, so do have a look at those. And just to note as well, bookings for next week's panel discussion are also now live, so you can book your place there. And that's another panel discussion like today's, but hosted by Alistair McNaught, and it's around the theory and the theme of assistive technology. So that's that. And so I think now, without further ado, welcome, like I say, to this session. So this is on exploring the roles of the disability practitioner. And I think we can all attest in our work to the fact that there isn't really one size fits all approach to being a disability practitioner. We've all got very diverse and varied roles. And I think that's really one of the great strengths of NADP in terms of our membership, is that we do have such a diverse range of members with various different roles, all under the umbrella of disability practitioner, and all with the main focus of supporting disabled students in education. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today, and I'm going to now introduce you to our panelists. So to start with, I'm going to introduce Pauline Melham, who is joining us from New Zealand as Manager of Disability Services at ARA Institute in Canterbury, New Zealand. So prior to that, Pauline was also an experienced practitioner in the UK as well. We are really delighted, Pauline, to have you with us today, and also particularly so given that you are joining us live from New Zealand. So you're giving up your sleep, I'm sure, to be with us. It must be very early hours of the morning with you.
It's about midnight, actually.
Oh, well, you're amazing. Thank you for joining us. That's really great.
Pleasure.
Next, I would like to introduce Gerard Norris, who is from Clearlinks. So many of our UK delegates may well recognise Clearlinks as a leading NMH provider, so provider of non-medical help support. So that's things like specialist study skills tuition, specialist mentoring, for example, amongst other things. So Gerard's role within Clearlinks is around developing systems to support staff to best and effectively deliver support to disabled students. So welcome to you, Gerard. Great to have you here.
Yeah.
Okay. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Chico McCrory, who is joining us from Writtle University College, which is in Essex in England. Chico, it's brilliant to have you here. Chico is Manager of Disability Services for Higher Education at Writtle, and has also got an extensive background, as with the other panellists, in disability practitioner work in a range of roles. Chico, I believe as well, you've got a background in accessible design and inclusive design as well.
Yes, yes, I do. Yeah.
It's really great to have you here today, and I'm looking forward to your input on the discussion. Thank you so much. And finally, last but of course, by no means least, we've got Brian Coleman. So Brian is Head of Disability Services and Dyslexia Support Services at the University of Sheffield. Again, as with the other panellists, extensive background in disability practitioner roles across many years and across the sector. So Brian, we're really grateful for you joining us today as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So to kick off the discussion, really, I just thought it'd be helpful to hear from panellists a bit more about your roles as practitioners and how support is set up in your respective areas of work to support disabled students. So I wonder, Brian, could I come to you first to start us off?
Yes, so I think we've got a fairly traditional setup as a team. So we have disability advisors, mental health advisors. We do have our own in-house support work service, which I think is less usual these days. And applicants and students, we encourage them to make contact, and And as soon as they do, we've got information on our website about how they can set support up, how they can obtain medical evidence, including the particularly difficult area of specific learning difficulties. So we've got a sort of full guide to that. And we do have a screener on our website. We do fund assessments for specific learning difficulties, which again, I think is increasingly rare. But so far, my bosses keep saying it's okay, so we keep doing it. Once the student gets to us, then obviously we have a discussion with them. We write what we call a learning support plan. Other people call them individual support plans, contracts, all sorts of things. But ours are called learning support plans. We agree the contents with the student, and they go out to the relevant academic departments with recommendations of what the department can do to support the student. Obviously, we also support them with the DSA process if that's relevant, because it's a bit of a nightmare. And we often, they will use our own in-house support work service. Obviously, that may depend on the DSA assessor and what they say in their report. We don't have the capacity really to follow up with students. We do depend on them or their departments to let us know if anything's not going well. I do remember the old days when I used to know most of my caseload by name and by face, but that's because I've been working in this field for a very long time. That just feels like a distant memory now, unfortunately. So we do rely on students and departments to come back to us, with the occasional exceptions of students where we can see they're going to need more contact with us, and we might arrange review appointments. The learning support plans aren't set in stone, and we make that very clear that they can be reviewed at any time or updated. Obviously, it's a big university with 50 departments, so we try and standardise what we do as much as possible, whilst being aware that we can't completely expect that across the university. But we work a lot with the departments and across the university to try and standardise the things that relate to us, at least. So exam arrangements, how learning support plans are stored and shared. So that's a quick snapshot of how we work.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian. That's really useful to know. I wonder, so Brian, you mentioned about having specialist kind of advisors in terms of mental health and general disability and other things. How does that reflect in your place, Chico, in terms of Writtle University College? Do you have similar setup, or how is it working there?
Yes, thank you, Helen, and thanks, Brian, for that. So we do have specialist staff within our team. So we have a specialist study skills tutor for specific learning difficulties, also specific specialist mentor for mental health, and specialist mentor for ASD. So they work quite closely. Our team sits under what we call the Wellbeing and Inclusion Department, and the specialist mental health staff work quite closely with the mental health advisor, who's actually for HE and FE, and then also the counselling staff, etc., and others who are actually for HE and FE. So there's quite a close relationship, I think, between the specialist staff and then the other sort of staff within the Wellbeing and Inclusion team who are for the wider institution as well.
Yeah. And how many students do you support, Chico? How many are registered, do you know?
Yeah, so Writtle University College is a specialist university college. So it started out as a sort of a land-based institution. It was established something like sort of 1890s there, and it's spread out over about sort of 200 hectares. So it's a really large campus. And some of the courses include like animal management, equine, land-based courses, design. There's also sustainable environments, food, etc., and sport courses. And so we have roughly about 800 students for HE and FEs, which make up about 30% of declared students, so students that declare a disability. So it's actually quite high, much higher than sort of the national percentage. And we do find that a lot of students who sort of enjoy, a lot of disabled students who enjoy that sort of tactile learning and very practical learning, and and also the smaller institution sort of fitting quite well with the college.
That's really interesting, and as you say, a very high percentage in terms of the national statistics. So okay, thank you for that. And Pauline, can I come to you next? How does that reflect? I'd be really keen to hear about the setup in New Zealand.
Yeah, it's quite different. I presume I'm not on mute.
You're not on mute, we can hear you perfectly.
Good, okay, fantastic. I'm working off my cell phone because my computer kept dropping out, so we'll see how that goes. The setup in New Zealand is quite different, and having worked for nearly 18 years in England, it's taken me quite some time to adjust. So I manage disability services at ARA Institute of Canterbury. That is a polytechnic. We are the largest polytechnic in the South Island of New Zealand. And we're actually undergoing some changes at the moment. So whilst there are currently 16 individual polytechs in New Zealand, they are streaming us into one national polytech, which is going to be quite interesting over the next few years as that happens. So at my institution, we have everything from foundation degree, so from foundation learners who are doing certificates in, certificates in carpentry and certificates in welding, certificates in tourism and hospitality, right up to people doing degrees and some postgraduate qualifications as well. We don't have very many postgrad students registered with our service. It is mainly undergraduates and those on pre-university courses. So we're a mixed institution. We are a tiny team and a tiny but growing. So currently, when I joined, there was myself and 2 half-time disability advisors, and we share an administrator with library and learning services and ourselves, plus that management team. I've just been lucky enough recently to be able to recruit another full-time disability advisor. So now there is myself full-time, another full-time 1.5 and 1.3. We don't have specialist staff in our polytech because we are too small to really have any, and so we employ generalist staff, which is of a great disappointment to me. Not that generalist staff aren't great, because I am one, but I would really like to have mental health advisors and study skills tutors, but we just don't really have those positions over here, and particularly not in a small polytech environment. Right. What I have found is that we didn't have mentors either when I started, and I really came to appreciate the value of a mentoring service when I worked in the UK. So that is something that I have pushed for and now got up and running within my own service. So we do actually have a mentoring service. We run a non-medical helper service ourselves, although it's not called that. And every now and then I slip up and still call it that, and everyone looks at me. So we have note takers and exam support workers and sort of study assistants, if you like, that we employ as casual workers. And then I have interpreters on self-employed contract. So again, we are a small team, and we get our learners in. We try and send an automated email to anyone who indicates that they have a disability on the enrolment form. If they contact us back, then we will get them in to see us and make an appointment. We are just in the stage at the moment where we're actually trying to do a project around contacting all those students that don't bother to make contact with us, just to make sure they're okay. That's quite time consuming, as you can imagine. So we get the students in, and then similar to what Brian was saying, we would have an appointment with them. We would undertake what we call a needs assessment, which is nothing like a DSA needs assessment. We would write up their individual action plan, and they would sign that, and we send that out to departments. We are just really getting into the stage where this year we have been automatically booking a 4-week follow-up appointment with each learner, so that we can check their progress and see how they are doing. But after we've done that follow-up, after the initial 4 weeks, then we kind of revert back to, you call us if you need us.
Yeah.
What else was I going to say? The funding system is really different here. So there is no such thing as the DSA. So funding is allocated to every tertiary institution by the central body, which for us is the Tertiary Education Commission. So it allocates us a amount of funding each year that we can support disabled students with. To be honest, it basically covers my team's salaries. It doesn't cover anything else. So my institution has to put almost double the amount of money in that is given to us through that grant. And that is the only money that is available for supporting disabled students.
Do you find, Pauline, oh, sorry, do you find there's a bit more flexibility in ways, though, if you, aside from the amount of money available, but in terms of how you can then allocate support? Do you find that's in some ways positive, or do you think it's not?
I would rather have an individualized support package like we did in the UK, particularly before things then changed with the level 1 and 2 NMH support. I find it really difficult that students don't have a funding package that they can apply for. So it's really difficult getting assistive technology for students, because whilst there is some government funding available, they are extremely tight about what they will and will not pay for. So every time I dare ask for something like Dragon Naturally Speaking or audio note taker for a student with specific learning difficulties, 9 times out of 10 we're turned down for that.
Right, gosh.
So it is a very different situation. We're trying to get more into encouraging our institution to purchase site licenses, so that we can actually give students copies of the software whilst they are a student, and then provide them with some assistance on how to use those things. So to be honest, whilst the government funding is there, I've got very, very little through it, and we're almost better to rely on institutional resources rather than applying to government funding.
Right, okay. Thanks for that, Pauline. Fascinating, really useful to hear a different perspective internationally in terms of New Zealand. Thank you.
Yeah.
Gerard, can I come on to you? So it sounds like quite a lot of our panelists have got some level of in-house NMH provision, but I know there's also many, many practitioners in the sector that don't have that in their higher education institutes or further education institutes. And I guess that's where ClearLinks comes in, is it? Would you like to tell us a bit about the support that you offer to students?
Yeah, so we are an outsourced service then. So students come to us with DSA2 letter, and we have to go about putting the support in place. There are a small number of institutions that fund. It's mainly what would have been the bands 1 and 2 support that we work with, but that isn't a big part of our work. It's mainly study skills tuition and mentoring. We're a team of about 50. So we have, and that's all office based or home based at the moment. And then we have several hundred support workers around the country, and we support several thousand students. Within that 50, we have different teams who are responsible for different things. So we have a support allocation service with people who receive DSA2 letters, and they do what we call matching, so matching up the support worker and the student. The support work is then overseen by the support delivery service, so day-to-day queries, and then we have a student engagement team who then are following up with students to find out how they're finding the support. If they don't have support after, if we match them and they don't have a session or a booking within a week, they're chasing those students up. What's wrong? Why have we had any support? And then my team is a central operations team, so we build the software and systems that we use in the business, and also we make some software that we sell externally. And one of the things that we build is a system called Crystal, which students use, universities can use, support workers use, and they can use that to check on their support. So students can see their diary, they can see when the next booking is. Support workers can book things in, they can add in strategies that they've worked on in sessions with students. They can add them onto Crystal, and then students can access them there. So we are quite different to everybody else, really. But I mean, there are lots of providers like ClearLinks, and there are lots of very good outsourced providers like us. And there's not necessarily all big companies like we are. There's lots of sole traders who provide really good and useful services, and a lot of those will work for people like ClearLinks as well. There are a finite number of people in this country who are qualified, and that's one of the things that we're talking to DFE a few years ago now about when they brought in the mandatory criteria, that there will be a lack of people in certain areas. And one thing that has made where support has then gone all online, that has enabled students in certain areas to be able to access more support, because if they are in some rural areas, there won't be qualified mentors, tutors for them to meet. So being able to meet some online has been useful and important for them.
That's a really good point, isn't it, Gerard? I think there are lots of disabled students, some students have really struggled in remote provision, but there's definitely lots that are reporting some real benefits to that. And that's definitely an area, as you say, for people that maybe are out living in the sticks or very remotely, that wouldn't previously have easily been able to access suitable and qualified support. That's really one of the big pluses. So great. Well, thanks for that. It's interesting that all the practitioners have touched upon kind of proactively contacting and following up with students about how things are going, or indeed not having capacity in the vast and ever increasing workloads that we all face to do that in some instances. I remember reading some responses from visually impaired students. I think it was research Birmingham did a few years back, where it was highlighted that one of the things that students were really struggling with was institutions like universities were saying, oh, we rely on people telling us, and students were saying, we don't know how to tell you if something's going wrong, or we don't know how to flag it, or we didn't want to cause trouble, we didn't feel we could. So maybe that, I think it's understandable that we're all in many ways not able to keep track of everything, but I think that's an area as a sector we really need to be looking at potentially as well. Brian, you mentioned in your introduction that you've seen over the years, you used to have a caseload where you knew the names of your students and you could kind of say everything about them. Whereas obviously, I think we all know that's going to not be the case now. Have you seen a rapid increase in student declarations of disability over the years? I
would say it's just inexorable. Is that the word? It just keeps going up every year. And a few years ago, I thought we maybe have reached a plateau in numbers, and I was was naive to think so. And the big thing I have found now is for years and years, students with specific learning difficulties were around about 40–45% of the students we saw. And I never thought another category would become bigger, but now mental health has overtaken specific learning difficulties. And I can remember a time when most disability teams didn't have a mental health advisor because they hadn't really seen the need. And then 20 years ago, probably the first, because I used to work at Sheffield Hallam then, and that's when they brought in a mental health advisor, and it felt quite a novel idea, and is this really necessary? And of course now we've got 2 who add up to 9 days a week. We've got a whole team of mentors. We've got a disability advisor who mainly sees students with mental health issues. So in a way, we've got, you know, more than, we're sort of two and a half advisors. So that's the big. The other categories tend not to. Autism has definitely slowly increased over the years, but the other categories have remained roughly the same. I think it's mental health in particular that has increased.
Yeah, we found the same at Oxford University as well, where I work. Chico, I was really fascinated. So you were saying that you don't get many students declaring disability on the postgraduate courses. Is that something, do you feel there's a reason for that, or have you explored it at all?
Yeah, well, we don't offer quite a lot of postgraduate courses. So we're largely very similar to Pauline. We're largely sort of undergraduate focused, and our postgraduates are only really few. So vet phys, veterinary phys as well, and other courses as well. So we tend to find that the majority is within the undergraduate. And I relate to what Brian was saying in terms of the increase in declarations for mental health. And I think in the conversations that we've been having with students and the research that we've been taking place over these last sort of few years, I think it's aligned with an increase in kind of just the awareness of mental health and the discourse, global discussion about mental health, and definitely more so within this year, the COVID year, anyway, from last year. So I think what we're seeing is more people actually just having a conversation about it and being actually a bit more confident to declare that throughout the time that they're at a university. So we're also seeing an increase of students that probably fit into one particular category actually also starts to declare mental health along with that. So an increase in multiple disabilities as well.
Great. So I think that leads us nicely into another field of questions, really more around inclusivity and inclusive practice. So I guess possibly the hope for practitioners is that longer term people wouldn't have to declare a disability, that as much as possible could be inclusive and embedded from the start. But we do hear the term, certainly in the UK, a lot about inclusivity and inclusive practice. And I wondered, what does that term mean to you as practitioners? Pauline, could I come to you first?
Yeah, sure. I think to me, inclusive practice, well, I really like the concept of universal design for learning. So inclusive practice to me is a lot about ensuring that our teaching and learning and assessment situations is accessible, and that students can access that content in a variety of ways, and they can show their strengths in a variety of ways, so that they can need less support from disability services or a service like ourselves, because their needs are being taken account of within the way that learning is designed. However, I think that whilst you see pockets of that embedded quite well in most institutions, I think it's really hard to get that to be something that is taken up by every single department in an institution. And I think there's, as I say, there's pockets of good practice. But I guess inclusivity is not just about the teaching and learning, it's about being able to physically get onto and move around campus easily. It's about the services that are available to students. It's a great deal about people's attitudes when they are interacting with disabled students, how they are treating them, how they are, you know, whether they're making them welcome at their service, whether they're thinking, oh, disabled student, quick, we'll pass that one to disability services because we don't know what to do with them. So inclusive practice is really, to me, about enabling all people with disabilities to access your services or your teaching and learning environment. And ideally, yes, the more inclusive an institution and the more open we are, the less support that those students and staff like myself would need. But I think in reality, there is always going to be areas of support that people will need support and accommodations and adjustments in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Pauline. And Chico, can I come to you? Do you echo kind of what Pauline said? Have you got thoughts on inclusivity and what it means for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what Pauline said is spot on. It is, for me, about including and learning from people with sort of a range of perspectives, a range of experiences. And so although inclusivity, I think, is very linked to disability and just sort of driven from, you know, legislation, very linked to disability, but it is about that diverse perspectives, diverse lived experiences, you know, so it's much wider from, in my understanding of that. And I see it as a way of doing, a methodology, sort of how we actually do things that enables us to draw on that full range of diversity, and that includes disability. So I think when we start to understand the interactions of disabled students with other types of perspectives, other types of diversities, that starts to build, I think, the picture of inclusivity. I also agree with Pauline about it's about that buy-in from different people and different stakeholders, and that can be quite difficult, I think, in trying to change that and shifting what is really a culture of disability, move that to disability services. If a student just mentions any of the keywords, you know, then people automatically signpost and sort of put that student off to our sort of services. So it is about trying to, I think, share a message and get to a point where different stakeholders within the higher education institution and FE as well are starting to understand the diverse perspectives. So when you've got people from the estates team, when you have people from the finance team, when you have teaching and learning staff, they understand these different perspectives, different experiences that students have, that disabled students have, and how that impacts the services that they provide. So part of that is understanding how we exclude people, why we exclude people, and providing them with sort of a place where they can say, students can say, I belong here, I have a sense of belonging within this space.
Great, thanks, Chico. And Brian, same to you. Do you share that view?
Hi, sorry, can you repeat the question? I was dealing with some Q&As.
Oh. What does we talk a lot about inclusivity in the UK, and I'm sure elsewhere as well. I wondered what that term means to you in terms of yourself and support for students.
I think so. We've always talked about the level playing field, and it's rather than wherever possible, rather than having to make adjustments retrospectively to make the playing field level, you try and build those things in from the start. Which is nice and easy to say, but I do like to compare it to designing and building a building, because we probably all come across buildings that needed retrofitting because the design had forgotten all about disabled people. So they've got silly doors or silly lifts or a silly entrance that as soon as a wheelchair user or a deaf person or a blind person turns up, it's glaringly obvious that they weren't thought of. And it's very similar with what universities do. If we think about these things at the beginning, at the design stage, and recently I was very pleasantly surprised that someone in our estates team had actually arranged for an architect to meet a group of disabled students at the design stage for a new building, and I knew nothing about it until the architect came to see me and said, that was fantastic, I'm going to make sure I always do that. So that's a good example of inclusive design, but it's also still important to remember, I think, that because I think this is, the government a few years ago used this argument to mess around with DSA and basically cut it. There will always be a need for reasonable adjustments for some people. I mean, it may be that in 50 years I'm proved wrong, but I don't think you can design something fully inclusively that no one would ever need an adjustment for. But if that may be possible one day, but I haven't seen it yet. So it's brilliant. It's something to aim for, but it shouldn't be used as a reason to cut funding or resources in other areas.
Absolutely. So we've all talked and touched upon kind of medicalised models really of funding bodies, whether it be through centralised sources in New Zealand or through the Disabled Student Allowance in the UK and other university funds for students and individual adjustments. That obviously feeds into kind of a medical model of working, in that students are having to evidence a disability, they're having to get medicalised reports or diagnostic assessments, and sometimes at great cost, whether it be to them or universities. It feels like there's quite a lot of barriers for students sometimes in doing that. And then equally, we talk about the importance of inclusivity and social model practices. How, as practitioners, do you kind of balance those sometimes competing models of working? And Chico, can I come to you?
Yes, I think the key word that you mentioned there is competing. It is, I think those models can be conflicting models, I think, in the way that we practice, and also in our rhetoric, you know, when we're promoting our services and our institution to applicants, prospective students, you know, the things that we're saying, and then sort of the conflict sort of happens in the processes and the multiple barriers, I think, that we sometimes have to, that students and applicants have to go through. So it is quite tough, I think, to try and get that balance right, you know, and to try and maybe shift to a much more sort of social model, especially because of, you know, the DSA and the funding and evidence, but also other different processes, you know, like finances, like admissions, like that, where we are having to, you know, to ask students constantly to fill forms and to evidence and to provide information over and over and over again. And then it's once they start teaching, and once they start going into the teaching and learning environment and the lectures and with their personal tutors. And so I think certainly, again, it's about that shift in culture and being able to promote that awareness of how students are impacted by some of these processes that we sort of traditionally kind of rely on and don't really want to move. And this is a really good time, I think, for it, because people are looking and thinking, actually, there are things that we didn't think could ever happen, but they can. You know, we can survive this and we can actually do better. We can do much better. So I think it is possible, but it will require, I think, a huge shift in the way that we think and how we have that culture within education.
Thank you. And Pauline, I'll come to you next.
Sure. Sorry, Helen, I dropped my phone at the at the time you were posing that question.
No problem. So I was just saying the competing sometimes or conflicting demands of you know, working in an inclusive way, but also within a medicalised model, often of funding things. Yeah. How do you kind of try and balance that dynamic in that competing framework?
Yeah, it's something that I think comes up all the time, and I'm always very aware of it. But I think perhaps I've become even more aware of it since moving back to New Zealand. For me, though, it's always been a situation where, as a practitioner, I thought to myself, yes, I do need the medical evidence for the student's impairment, whatever that might be, because we need to actually know that we are supporting the right cohort of student and that they do have a genuine disability that we are supporting. Because sadly, human nature being what it is, we all know that there are some people out there that will try and use our services who actually have no need to, because they are not disabled, but they will try and put it on. So there is a need to verify it. And I still think that medically is probably the best way to do that. Or rather, I don't think we found a better way yet to do that. I think, though, as soon as I've got that evidence under my belt or in my filing system, I'm like, right, and now I become a social model practitioner. So it's almost like confirmation, and then I very much become, what is it you need as the student sitting in front of me? What is it you find difficult? What is it you feel you are good at? Mm-hmm. Those sorts of things. So it's almost like that confirmation. I think why it's even harder in New Zealand, but it's probably going that way from things Brian was saying right at the start, is that we are unable to fund diagnostic assessments for specific learning difficulties or any other disability for that matter. But particularly specific learning difficulties, and they are expensive. They are typically anything from 650 to 800 New Zealand dollars. They're a lot more if you live in Auckland. Being in the South Island, it's a bit cheaper. So that's sort of 300 to 400 British pounds. And particularly for a lot of our students, that and a lot of the students studying at a pre-degree level, especially, a lot of them are from your lower socioeconomic groups, and they don't have 300 to 400 pounds equivalent to put towards that sort of report that they need. And we're trying to get them to go through hardship funding for it, through our institutional hardship funding, but actually that's not something that has been done consistently up until now, essentially. And so there's still a lot of students that are afraid to go through hardship because they're afraid that they're going to need that money for something else later in their course. And if they spend it all on a diagnostic assessment, they might not get it. So a lot of it is about us selling to students and being very careful how we sort of sell, if you like, the hardship fund, where we say, actually, this is what if you need hardship, this is the maximum amount you're entitled to in a year, and your assessment is not going to eat all that up. So if something else goes wrong, there will still be money in the pot for you. But it's quite hard to get students to go through that process. They're very reluctant.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Okay, thanks for sharing that, Pauline. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to move on to just quickly, I'd like to talk to Gerard, because I think we've not talked to you enough, Gerard. I want to get your input. So let's move on to talk a bit about the pandemic quickly. So obviously, I think we can't ignore the fact that the last year and a quarter has been a time of substantial upheaval and change for all services, I'm sure. Gerard, can you talk to me a bit about what was required in terms of how you've had to adapt support at Clearlinks to move to presumably quite overnight remote provision for students? And you mentioned that's beneficial in many ways, but I imagine it wasn't without challenge.
Yeah, I mean, we literally went fully everything remote before the government said you had to. So we thought this is what's going to happen, so we did that. And we've, over the past few years, where we'd had students, as I said before, where they were in places where there weren't support workers. We had tried to persuade them to have support online, and some had gone for it, some were very reluctant, some tried it, didn't like it, some tried it, liked it. But we had lots of documentation that we built up around that and guidance, so we're able to just kind of distribute that to everybody. What we did, we had a couple of tutors and mentors who worked for us then as almost consultants, so they would talk to support workers, tutors, mentors who were worried, who were nervous about how this would work. You know, there were people who had never used Zoom or Skype or anything like that, and well, now they're a major part of our lives. But yeah, I mean, support workers in particular were nervous about how it would work. Students less so. I think they were more accepting that this is how it was going to happen. And then as it's gone on, we've found that the new students are completely happy having the support online. Some of the students who who were in later years of their courses had support face to face, and would prefer to go back to that. And I think that's what we will see, that the newer students recognise that this is a good way of having support, but there are other students who will prefer just to have that more face-to-face contact. Mm-hmm. We did our annual survey, so just having a look before we came on here. So we do an annual survey to all our students, and so one of the questions that we asked was, how have you found having support online? Just over 35% said they love it. 47.5% said they were happy with it. Just under 13% said it was fine. Just under 3% said they weren't keen, and 1.5% said they don't like it. Wow. So we were quite surprised that it was so positive. Yeah. And although we have seen a greater uptake in support, and now that could be for any number of reasons. I mean, it could be because it is much easier to have support. You don't have to leave the house, you don't have to travel. Yep. It could be because people have needed more support, as they haven't been able to have as many meetings with their academic tutors, and more feeling of anxiety. But it's for us, it seemed to be positive, and the comments that we've had from students, a lot of that has been about they haven't had the anxiety by still having to have support, or having the support for the first time. It's been something that's created structure for them in a way where there is, the world's in a bit of a mess. They've at least had an hour of support each week, maybe at the same time, that's kind of they can rely on. So yeah, I mean, we asked support workers how they had found delivering support online. Mm-hmm. And there was only one person who was indifferent. Everyone else was either loved it or it's been fine. Right. And yeah, 99.49% of people said they wanted to continue providing support online. So
yeah, I mean, it's great that the student feedback so far is suggesting that that's been great. So, and the fact the practitioners are equally seem to find it's working. Brian, can I come to you, because I guess certainly in the higher education institution I work at, we found room pressures have always been, room booking pressures have always been a bit of a nightmare, in that we're sharing space, and Chico and Pauline, you may be the same in your places, but it can add to the length of time that is available to offer a student appointments, whereas with remote meetings, there's not that constraint. Has that been your experience, Brian?
Yes, yeah, I mean, our team is across 3 buildings, and realistically it's more like 5 or 6, because we have to try and find rooms for one-to-one sessions, like mentoring, for instance. Yeah. So going completely online has got rid of a lot of those problems. It's also meant, because of rules around health and safety and lone working, we've not been able to offer evening sessions on campus, but suddenly we can do that because everyone's in their own house. And so that's yeah, there's been lots of advantages, and similar to what Gerard's saying, a lot of the students and the support workers are saying either that they'd be happy to carry on online when we're all back on campus, or that they'd actually prefer it. Obviously, distance learning has always, there's always been a small number of distance learners where we've had to try and arrange something like that. But it was, as I'm sure we all know, quite a shock last March to move 100% online. But it was strangely straightforward, actually. And most of the time, the students, obviously, they were sympathetic at first, but then I think they actually often prefer it. They don't have to leave their house. They don't have to walk across a dark campus in winter or whatever it might be. They don't have to commute. So, yeah, it's been a bit of a revolution, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think there was possibly some strength of feeling in students, that with students I've spoken with, certainly, but around a bit of frustration, really, that actually sometimes people have been asking for remote access to things for quite a while for different reasons. Indeed, the same with lecture capture and things. And sometimes some places less resistance, some places slightly more. But yeah. I think I sense there's, a lot of people out there that are saying, well, hang on, now that it's for the masses, that's, been quite easy to do, actually, hasn't it? So
well, I keep saying that things that we as a disability team were told were not possible for years suddenly became possible in one week.
Yeah, well, let's hope that that's something of a momentum that can be taken forward in the future.
Yeah.
And I'm just, again, one eye on the time because I want to leave chat. We've got some questions coming in, which is great from our delegates. And just a reminder, people, if you would like to pop questions in the Q&A section, please, and that will help us to spot them. And we're getting some good comments on the chat as well. But just to close, really, quick questions to you all. I wondered if you could tell me, and I'll start with you, Pauline, it's just one thing that you really love about your role.
I think what I've always loved about the disability role is that I can never assume that I know everything, because every time I think I've got it covered and I've seen everything I'm likely to see, someone else walks in the door with a condition I've never heard of, or a whole new cohort of students sort of comes my way, and all of a sudden I'm dealing with issues that I haven't dealt with before. So for me, what I quite like about it is that it's a very changing role, and yeah, you never quite know what to expect. I mean, 15 years ago, we were hardly supporting any students with autism. And now autism is something that we see a lot of. And similarly, as I think it was Brian was saying about mental health as well. And I think the other thing I enjoy about my role is just the students. I actually really enjoy sitting down with the students, talking to them one-to-one, and supporting them, to get that initial support in place so that they can be successful. And I'm supposed to do less of that as a manager. And I find it very hard to let that go entirely and let my team
do it. Don't let it go, Pauline. Don't let it go. I'd say that's fair. Thank you. And Chico, can you tell us one thing you love about your role?
Yes, I absolutely love how diverse it is. Like every day is different. The conversations that we have with students are so different. The conversations that we have about improving disability support is different constantly. So it's so varied, and it keeps the momentum going. And I think it also pushes, that variation sort of pushes us to innovation, thinking beyond and kind of just beyond our own, my own biases, my own experiences. So I really enjoy that. I love the contact with multiple students and multiple people. I think that's definitely a key area.
Brilliant, thank you. And Gerard, I come to you. What's one thing you love about your role?
Similar to everyone else, like it is just such a, you never know what's going to happen on the morning. Yeah, and it does make it quite exciting. And even when there's challenges that might come from support workers or students or the government, they're always fun to tackle.
Yeah, brilliant. And Brian,
Yes, definitely definitely the variety, and there's always something new, even if you've come across that disability many times. Suddenly they're doing a course that you've never considered. How do you do that course without those support needs? So that's always happening. Sometimes it's too exciting. I wouldn't mind it being a bit less exciting, but then I've got friends with very boring jobs, and I'm glad that I don't have a boring job. And I think the other thing is just working with young people, because I'm getting on now, and when you talk to 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds, their sort of perspective on life and all the possibilities in front of them is quite a enlivening feeling, I think, talking to them. Yeah, well, wonderful. Thank you so much for that discussion. I hope people have found it interesting to hear your insights. I'm sure they have. I certainly have. I'm going to stop the panel discussion from me at this point and open it up to questions that I can see have been coming in thick and fast in the chat. So again, please keep posting them. So Pauline, there's a question here for you. It says, thanks for your input. Do you have an equivalent to the Equality Act 2010 expectation of inclusive practice and anticipatory adjustments in HEIs in New Zealand?
We do. I was just talking about this evening, actually, with a group of third-year students that I went into a class and spoke to. So in New Zealand, our key legislation is the 1993 Human Rights Act, which covers employment and education. But it's not terribly specific about things like inclusive practice, and so it's very broad. And the other thing with our human rights legislation is that, unlike the UK's, where if you discriminate against a person with a disability, you might find yourself in county court. In New Zealand, you go to mediation with the Human Rights Commission. And I have to say that employers and educational institutions are not nearly as frightened of mediation as they are of a looming court case. We signed up to the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons, and we now also have a New Zealand disability strategy. So more and more, and just recently, and I alluded to this, I think at the start, where our Tertiary Education Commission has just sponsored the update of our national framework for disabled students. So a little bit like what the QAA Code of Practice used to be. So they've just sponsored an update of that, and then they're now going to be asking us all to write disability action plans and to be reporting on our institutional performance and tying our funding into that. So I think that we will start to see institutions having to respond more and to be more specific about their responses than perhaps what they have been in the past.
Great.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you, I'm sure. Lynn, I should welcome you. I'm so sorry I didn't introduce you. So Lynn is Operations Manager at NADP. I'm sure you'll all know her very well, and has been integral to the organising of this conference. But Lynn is joining us to help with managing some of the questions. Do you want to kind of, you've had a proper look, I think, Lynn, I'm just scrolling through them now.
Yeah, there seems to be an awful lot in chat, as well as questions regarding remote support sessions. So probably for you to start off with, Gerard, in that people are saying is that students are saying that they actually really enjoy them, but are they actually as effective? And is there anything going on to monitor the effectiveness of online support?
It's a good question, and it's hard to know. I mean, there's certainly, it's a different way of working with a student. I mean, for study skills in particular, the the benefits for a student of not having to bring a laptop to sessions, but to be able to work collaboratively on using like Google Docs and things like that. So the support work and the student are on Zoom, but then they're looking at the piece of work that the student's got, they're looking at the question, they're looking at whatever strategies, and that way of working, I think, is actually better than, I mean, when I was at university and I had face-to-face study skills support, you're using pieces of paper and writing out a question, and here's what this part of the question means. But if you can actually be doing the work, in the morning, you're sat at your laptop, you then have an hour with your study skills tutor working on something that's real, and then be able to go straight back to working. I think there's a lot of value in that. There will still be a need for face-to-face support, because it isn't going to work for everybody, and so we have to let it always be the student's choice. And if they report that it isn't for them, then we have to change. And I think it's just, I mean, as difficult as it is, and I know resources is a problem. It's going back to the students and finding out how it is working for them. Is it what they expected? Would they like to do something different? Just making sure that they are 100% happy.
Yeah, I think we really need some research in this area, not only the effectiveness of it, but who's engaging and who's not engaging. There's definitely some comments coming through about those with mental health conditions. Maybe there are some indications that they might not be engaging as well, whereas other people are enjoying it. Now, I had a really interesting conversation with the Thomas Pocklington Trust about visually impaired students enjoying the online support because it was easier than having to get out and get to sessions. But I also had a conversation with the National Deaf Children's Society, their higher education rep, saying that a lot of deaf students were actually appreciating the online support, which they hadn't expected, because they weren't getting so anxious about whether they were in the right place and how to access the sessions, and whether someone would start talking to them and they didn't have a sign language interpreter with them to help. So their anxiety levels were less. So I think we need some research in this area. I've no idea how it's going to be done. Does anyone else have any comments about the support sessions? Pauline?
I think from a New Zealand perspective, and if you think about our services and how we were impacted, as I've said, we don't have study skills advisors specifically for students with dyslexia, and at the time we went into lockdown, we didn't have a mentoring service either. So that happened post-lockdown. But I work quite closely with our learning services team, who support or who are open to support all students. Funnily enough, since I've arrived in New Zealand, they support a lot more disabled students than they used to. And they had to move their one-to-one support sessions online very quickly. And anecdotally, they have found that they still offer online support, even though we have been back now since June, July 2020. We've been back in our institutions and in the office. So it's certainly still going on, and some students, as you say, absolutely love it, and are actually really keen and request a Zoom appointment. And they're finding, our advisors are reporting that it's working well, that all they do is share screens and they can bring up documents and work together. As for research, I think you're right. I think it would be really interesting to see what research would bear out in this area. But anecdotally, we're finding it's still worth offering both face-to-face and Zoom sessions, even though we are back on campus with our students and have been, almost for 2 semesters now.
What about you, Chico? Is there a difference maybe between the further ed and higher ed students?
Well, in the conversations that we've been having with students, we found that a lot of FE students were really keen to get back on campus, and a lot of first year AG students were also very keen to resume that face-to-face contact. We have a communication support team who work in HE and FE, and they work with sort of deaf students, and they have also really been sort of pushing for more one-to-ones with students on campus based on the conversations that they've been having with students. So it's been a mixture, but we have found that the FE students are very keen, I think, to get back on campus and to have students. So they're choosing really to have those one-to-one sessions on campus. And a lot of our sort of third years and fourth year students are then choosing to go remotely. But again, I think I support with what everybody's saying. It's about offering the choice and giving them the ability to sort of choose whether or not this week it supports remotely or moving face to face. But how effective it is something that needs a bit more research, to understand whether or not it is effective.
Are you having the same experience, Brian, at Sheffield?
So I couldn't unmute myself then. The quick answer is yes, because I can see we've got 10 minutes left, but yes, nothing particularly to add to that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
What other questions have we had? Well, we've had quite a lot about the inclusivity discussions. And Laura was saying about the difficulties with inclusivity and accessibility in placement settings. And does anyone have any advice for engaging with employers to actually increase that? We'll go back to you, Brian, since you managed to unmute yourself.
I mean, it goes on forever, and obviously we had a case recently where the student had applied for access to work funding. Access to work suggested she had a support worker on her placement. The placement provider, which is a famous national company, said, oh, she doesn't need that. And we found ourselves in this very strange position of who's responsible. We felt she needed a support worker. Access to work did. She did. The only person who disagreed was one HR manager at this big company. And in the end, she ended up skipping the year in industry and graduating a year early. So that was an awful outcome, which we are still discussing with our solicitors, not because she complained, although I think she probably could have done, but because we wanted to get clarification. And the answer came back from the solicitors that that was not our responsibility. We did what we could do. So that's a terrible example to start this answer with. Most of the time it goes better than that. And obviously we have a medical school, a nursing school, so courses with huge amounts of placement. I think the key thing is if you can find the person in the academic department who is the link person, who is the placement officer or similar to that. It's not always easy to find them, and sometimes you realize they don't actually exist. So then you have to go to the manager or the head of department and maybe suggest that there should be one, because without that direct link with the placement providers, it's very difficult to communicate or be taken seriously, I suppose. You need that kind of weight of that, you need that relationship there, which obviously as one central team in a massive university we won't have. And the rest of it's just variety. Some are better than others, some are more willing to listen than others, but you've got politics where, let's say, the nursing school is always trying to maintain good relationships with placement providers and not annoy them too much. So it is quite a minefield, and it can take quite a lot of work. But I think once you get some good examples, you can share them with other people. You can say, well, we had a student on placement last year where we thought it could be difficult, but everything went really well. She did really well. the placement provider was pleased to see what was possible. So sometimes it's, if you've got nothing else, it's just good examples if you've got them to share.
Anyone else want to come in on that one? Chico, is it the same for, I'm presuming you're doing placements with your students as well?
Yeah, we are, and we historically have had a few issues with this at an AT level, and so we started having more conversations with FE, with the FE lecturers, because for pretty much all of the FE courses, there's some level of a placement involved. So they are very experienced at this and in trying to have those conversations with placement providers, etc. So we're trying to sort of learn from them as to how to do it in the most effective way. And part of that is about relationships, because the lecturers and others have very close relationships with providers, and often it's having the conversations within those small bubbles that already exist can actually sort of emphasize this need to share information and make sure that reasonable adjustments are being put in place for all students, and caring for that students and what that process is. So it's, I think for us at the moment, it's trying to feed into the conversations that are being had with the placement providers at the initial stages of trying to plan the placements. We find that tends to work a bit better.
Yeah, I was involved with trainee teachers, and we found that some of the schools were very concerned about taking a disabled trainee teacher. And when we offered to go around and assist them with their risk assessments that they desperately needed to do and had no idea how to do, so the student and a member of disability staff from the university would visit the school and go through. That was really helpful as well. Okay, we'll change the subject slightly. I had one in mind and it's just gone. Oh, I know. We were talking about, and it's happening on chat as well as happening on the Q&A, the fact that we seem to have made some real advances in support for students in examinations and in lectures. We've made life a lot easier for some of our disabled students, at least, by moving online. And Mary was just one who said, do you think we'll go backwards when teaching comes back on campus with less lectures recorded and less, this is my addition, reasonable adjustments for exams? Pauline? Did you go back, I suppose?
Yes,
is what I'm asking here.
I think there was some amount of going backwards. I think some people have seen the light, if you like, and have decided that recording their classes on Zoom, which is what we tend to use, and then placing those up on Moodle has been a real advantage to students, so they continue to do so. I think there is now some online provision offered, to some of our students. I know our entire trades department has, for I think it's all their level 3 courses, which are like their pre-apprenticeship courses, have moved to 2 days taught and 1 day online for their learners. I think there has been a quite a bit of slippage backwards, but I think some of that good practice has continued forward. It may well be different for yourselves because, as I say, we had a couple of months of this. You've had well over 12 months of having to work this way, which means it's become far more embedded than perhaps the knee-jerk reaction that we had to make, and then within a couple of months we were back to normal again. Sorry to keep gloating about that, by the way.
I'm just very conscious of the time, so some people I'm sure will have to leave, and we can stay on and maybe ask the latter question to other panelists as well. But just in case there are people that need to go now, just to say thank you so much to you all for joining us, and especially thanks to all our panelists today. You've been wonderful. It's been really great meeting some of you for the first time, and also just chatting with you and getting your input on these really important areas. So thank you so much, and thank you to the delegates that have attended today. And just to reiterate what we said at the start, this has been videoed and the recording will be going up on the NADP website as soon as we can get it captioned fully and edited. So do look out for that, and I hope you found it interesting. And do also look at the videos that I mentioned earlier that are on the website. I think Chico might have saved the link and sent it in the chat as well, but there's some really great videos from a range of practitioners. So yeah, do have a look at those too, and get yourself your balloon. Yeah, sorry to hijack that last bit, but I just thought, because there will be people I'm sure that have to go to other meetings.
I think
Yes,
what Pauline's saying is, the worse you handle the pandemic, the more opportunity you get to learn about online learning.
Indeed, absolutely.
Swings and roundabouts.
Absolutely.
Okay, I put another link up to the balloon race if anyone wants to have a look at it and join in. I've got a little balloon with a rabbit on it up there, so you can really customize it to your own needs.
Oh, the other thing to note, I think I'm right saying this, Lynn, there is CPD recognition available for attending the conference sessions, but we will be sending out a link to people just for feedback on how you found it. So, and your CPD certificate is not linked to what feedback you give us, so be honest. But just to say, do fill that in, and then you'll be able to claim it as a CPD if that's helped you in your roles.
We have we'll have an online form to fill in that really will not take you too long, and you can indicate which webinars you went to. They'll only give us CPD for the webinars, unfortunately, and then write about a couple of lines on how you intend to use any information in your own setting. And if you attend all the 5 webinars, you can get up to 12.5 hours of CPD points, which I know people are desperately struggling for this year, with universities not being able to afford to pay for it for them. So we hope that helps you all.
Can I just say, Chico and other panelists, there's a few people requesting your contact details and things in terms of email addresses. Maybe we could speak afterwards about whether you'd be happy to share those, but presuming that's okay, I'm sure we can put that up on the NADP website as well for people.
Or messages can come directly through the office. If people have direct questions, I'm happy to forward them to panelists.
Perfect, thanks, Lynn.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think that's 14:32 in UK time. Pauline, I dread to think what time it is with you, but bless you, you're still awake, which we're very grateful.
1:32.
Oh, well, thank you so much to everyone. I think at that point we'll draw this session to a close, but yeah, thank you all for joining us.